Hello and welcome to the Drexel InterView. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Peck Alumni Center at Drexel University. Today my guests are cultural critic Camille Paglia and legal scholar Laura Beth Nielsen. Dr. Paglia is professor of humanities and media studies at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. Dr. Nielsen is a research professor at the American Bar Association and a director of legal studies at Northwestern University. I'm pleased to have them here following a conference held at Drexel University entitled Free Speech on the College Campus. Camille Paglia and Laura Beth Nielsen were our keynote speakers. During this interview, we're going to revisit some of the ideas touched on in their talks and address this vexed subject as comprehensively as we can. Camille Paglia, Laura Beth Nielsen, welcome to the Drexel InterView.
Thank you.
So there have been various incidents on college campuses involving free speech in the recent past. And I want to start with a concrete example, an example that happened at Yale in 2015 over Halloween, where the university administration sent out an email saying that students should be thoughtful in their choice of Halloween costumes. Another professor, she was a professor of early childhood education, wrote an email after that saying that she didn't think it was appropriate for the administration to do this and that students should be allowed to be a little bit inappropriate, I think she said, and maybe even offensive in their choice of costume if they so chose. This caused an angry reaction by some students at Yale and then a backlash by others. And this became something of a furor at the university. And I wonder what you think of this whole brouhaha. And I'll start with you, Laura Beth.
I think this Yale incident was a great opportunity to talk in a sustained and meaningful way about these issues. I remind my students that they might want to be thoughtful prior to Halloween. If I'm teaching a large lecture class, I bring it up and we can talk about presentation of race, we can talk about presentation of sex and sexuality. We know that Halloween has become very sexualized for women. Women's outfits tend to be very revealing, and so there's a lot of drinking on college campus. So it is a dangerous weekend, and I think it is something, given that our students live on campus, they're learning, we're trying to walk them through these difficult issues of navigating these social conundrums, to have a conversation. Now, whether anyone was being censored or felt like they couldn't speak up, it seemed like a very healthy conversation. Of course, I'm not at Yale, so and I understand that it became a big brouhaha, but those are exactly the kinds of conversations I think we want to facilitate at the university, especially as people who are teaching feminism, who are teaching race, who are teaching law. We want to help students translate what they're learning from the classroom into how they're living their lives.
Camille.
Well, I take completely the opposite view as Laura Beth here. And Halloween for me is one of the great transgressive moments in the history of holidays. There are a couple of issues here. Number one, I do believe that university administrations should have no business interfering in any student events except if criminal behavior is committed. The university was completely out of line, in my view, in trying to suppress the power of transgressive imagination. I myself, Halloween was for me my great holiday of the year. As a small child, it's where I could dress as a man. Okay, as I was a Roman soldier. I was a toreador. I was Napoleon was one of the greatest moments of my life. I was Hamlet based on the classics comics book and so on. All right, the idea that supervising authority, would try to dictate how students have the perfect right to violate every taboo and to be rude and raucous. And my attitude is let the students fight these things out among themselves.
Do you think that behind this was one particular costume, which would be blackface? That there was a kind of a code here for this is taboo, this is really this would be offensive. I mean, that, dressing as a woman dressing as a man wouldn't be a problem, a man dressing as a woman wouldn't, but that race is at the center of this? I mean, I only thought of this right now as I'm talking to you.
Also, there are Latino issues as well. In the West, there have been issues of Mexican Americans objecting to theme parties with sombreros. Yes, they found a reductive view, or Native American actually as well. I think the use of war bonnets and et cetera.
Or
but again,
Pocahontas from the Disney film.
Yes, but I mean, my view, okay, is that it's up to the students themselves to police their own costumes and to react. If there's something that's offensive, let the students be empowered to object.
I totally agree. I don't think we disagree as much as you think. But as the professor, I mean, do you see a difference between the administration saying being thoughtful about your costume and me as in the classroom? I feel like I have the right to say to them, we are studying this, let's talk about what you're going to do. They can do whatever they want, but I want to facilitate a conversation about what that would mean and why blackface is offensive to some people. And so that if they choose to be transgressive, they understand what they're transgressing, because I teach a lot of freshmen. They don't know yet. They don't understand these
you're
debates
making a
yet.
distinction between an educator and an administrator, which is actually a very important distinction that has grown up more and more within universities these days. We have many, many administrators who are concerned about legal issues. And then we have faculty members who are trying to teach complex subject matter. Is that at the crux of what may be the tension here?
In my view, I feel a teacher has no right acting like a minister, essentially, okay, ahead of a student event. Now, I think that, again, I don't think the faculty members have any right, okay, to produce a feeling of moral duty and to almost like spreading mayonnaise, okay, over a piece of toast. I don't. After the event, let's say there was an incident, a rancorous incident of confrontations, then I think that would be a great teaching moment and to open up the class for discussion of what happened. But I think I would object to an a priori warning, okay, about from faculty members saying, telling students to be thoughtful, because the entire counterculture rebellion of the 1960s was in fact a kind of violation of the code of etiquette and politeness of the 1950s.
Which brings me to my next question, which is, there is a certain amount of, I would say, social activism on campus now, and I wonder how you would compare it to what happened in the late 60s and 70s. How is it similar? How is it different? Laura Beth.
I think it's just fascinating to look at the new ways that students and members of traditionally disadvantaged groups are advancing their causes at the university. It looks very different for a variety of reasons. The use of social media, obviously, the use of the availability of YouTube, and everybody's got a phone in their pocket all the time. Everybody's got a video camera, can make a movie at any time and upload it right away. And so we're able to see a lot more events in real time. One of the reasons it looks less familiar than the kind of activism we were seeing in the 60s is that not as much of it is directed against the state, right? So in the 60s, it's voting rights. We want the state to give us the right to full political participation or full civic participation in terms of public accommodation laws. Now, there's the equality movements have shifted as the nature of discrimination has shifted in society. Lots of formal barriers have, been erased, and yet we still have, wage gap. We still have with women making 77 cents on the dollar, white women making 77 cents on the dollar, African American women making 52 cents on the white man's dollar. So I think you're starting to see resistance to more subtle and perceived kinds of discrimination that we weren't talking about in the 60s, and yet that together work to perpetuate the kinds of inequalities that are, still apparent along race and class in this country.
Well, I think possibly in the 60s it was a bit clearer that protesters were agitating against the government, okay, rather than the administration. Occasionally there were uprisings against college administrations. For example, a friend of mine participated in the invasion of the president's office at Columbia. Okay, that shocked people, etc. But I just feel, in general, okay, I'm concerned that too many of of young protesters are arguing for an expansion, okay, of authority on the part of the university or the government, and they're asking for protections, whereas we, in general, in the 1960s, were trying to break down authoritarian intrusion into private life.
Do you think that there's less understanding of history now, or law for that matter, than there was in the 60s and 70s, and that may be part of the some of the reaction that students are having and some of the pushback that they're getting from older people who maybe have had a different kind of education?
Well, I definitely feel that my generation of the 1960s had a greater sense of history simply because of our parents' experience. They had in their childhood the Depression, and then they had fought in World War II. Then there was the discovery of the Holocaust, and then the Cold War with the threat of nuclear extinction of the world. So we had this sense of the atrocities of history behind us, and this younger generation, I think, has been deprived of historical consciousness by a very banal public school education that is all about manipulating feelings and making people get along, okay, but is on the whole, seems to me, denuded of an introduction to the harsh facts of history as well as world geography.
Do you think that's true, Laura?
Well, and not to mention abstinence-only sex education, right? Just throw that in there as well. I think certainly there are these deficiencies. I was born in the 70s, so it's hard for me to talk about it in the experiential sense. But
you're
what
the youngster here.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But what I see is students who are coming, at least to Northwestern, coming from different kinds of backgrounds, thirsty to know this stuff. And so we are so lucky because we have the opportunity to be able to teach them. Now, for me in Chicago, we're living it every day on the news. The racialized murder of black men by white police officers and other African American people on the streets is pervasive in Chicago. And it's tragic and it's every day. So I think there are different kinds of sufferings and there are different kinds of experiences. And I think we're beginning to acknowledge different sets of problems, right? It might not be the Holocaust, but it's certainly a type of Holocaust that's going on, the death and incarceration of African American men in this country.
Well, that I was going to ask as my next question, whether you thought that the explosion of representation of police and black youth being brutalized or killed by police as a result of social media, the fact that we have smartphones to take these, is spilling over into the campus. And this is part of the anger and the reactivity of students, is that this social context outside the university is being somehow assimilated and part of the response.
Well, my feeling is that what's being erased here, okay, is that the greatest danger to young black men is not really the police, whose behavior has been atrocious, I admit, okay, but rather other black men. Okay, so for me, the issue is the abandonment of the inner cities, right, and the decline in quality of public school education for the poor. Now, I come from an immigrant background. All four of my grandparents and my mother were born in Italy. When my mother came over here at 6, not speaking a word of English, she was greeted, okay, with an extremely strict and substantive public school education, and there was a great attention paid to the immigrants. So my mother ended up speaking without an accent and got all A's, even though she had not done a word of English when she arrived. So I think that and also the decline in manufacturing, okay, has eliminated a huge area for young inner city residents, okay, to get jobs directly out of high school. So I think there's a combination transformation of I think the absence of jobs is huge. I think that the intensity, the pressure cooker atmosphere of the city is coming from the joblessness, the hopelessness, and the abandonment of the schools. Okay, huge amounts of money are thrown at our public school system, but it's not giving the young African Americans what they need. I have called for example, courses in entrepreneurship, okay, at the high school level, so that young African Americans with ideas will learn business. They're not getting it obviously from their homes. They don't see people with jobs who know how to handle money and so on. The basics of finances should be taught, okay, to African Americans, right in the from the middle school to the high school level.
Well, I agree that the problem is systemic, and luckily we have a lot of really good social science research that tells us how to solve these problems, and there are many of the things you suggest. I wouldn't say we're throwing a lot of money at our public education, but what money we're throwing, little I think, but you're right, is directed in these to things that aren't necessarily going to advance people where they are. But there are a lot, it's a lot besides education, right? It's public housing, it's a social safety net so that health problems don't bankrupt a family. It's a system of lending that's not predatory on people who live in areas of concentrated poverty, which tend to be racialized African American in this country. So I do think it's a broad set of interlocking, overlaid programs that we have a responsibility to enact if we care about the systemic murder and incarceration of this whole group of people in our country.
But getting back to education, because that is one piece of the system, it does strike me, and it is this systemic problem, what is it we should be teaching? I mean, we have two schools, so to speak. One is that we should be teaching more social awareness, more sense of social justice, more awareness and tolerance of diversity, et cetera. And then the other piece is teaching history, teaching about, some body of knowledge that students can share and talk through. And if you look at a university education these days, very different from the way it was when I was in the university, it's a sort of potpourri where many of the professors are teaching their hobby horses that have to do with rather narrow areas, and the students then, what kind of comprehensive education are they getting from this? How are they learning how to be citizens, how to be thinking people? I guess I'm speaking now from my own point of view, not asking a question, but I wonder what you think about the curriculum, because you are a professor in a number of areas at Northwestern, so you see this in a number of contexts. Tell me your thought about what you think students are getting out of their education and whether it's serving them well.
Well, one of the great things about Northwestern is that we do view a liberal arts and humanities education as central for the students that are in the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, which is where my tenure home is and where I teach. And that college thinks very hard with a number of committees, and in fact, we've just begun one to think completely broadly and in new ways about if we should have a great books curriculum like the University of Chicago, if we should continue with the distribution areas. There should be universities that are doing all of these things, and students should know what they're interested in and find the right place for them. And if it's a technical school, it's a technical school. If it's a liberal arts and humanities place and you want to be involved in research, maybe that's Northwestern, maybe it's Dartmouth. If you want to be an engineer, it's probably Drexel or MIT, right? So I think there should be a wide variety but then at the campus level, there has to be sustained thought by tenured professors who value the core of what it means to have a higher education degree, working together to understand, I don't know what you need to know in chemistry, but I can work with the chemistry professors and we can develop either some sort of curriculum that is shared by the community.
It's easier said than done, I think.
Oh, I know, I'm on the committee.
I mean, what is it? You say we have humanities education, but then the question is, what is humanities education? What should humanities education be? Camille.
Well, I strongly believe in a historical survey structure, which is now considered quite unfashionable. And unfortunately, most of the graduate students who have emerged in the past 30 years really are not prepared to teach that kind of way, because they had the impact of postmodernism and poststructuralism, which dissolves and atomizes and fragments everything. So I think we have an absolute disaster zone in higher education today. Everything is on these individual courses scattered, a cafeteria approach. The students don't know how to choose. Okay, when I arrived in college, well, we still had the catalog in paper form, which was fabulous, I thought. Okay, because you would leaf through it and you could read, you could see the whole world of knowledge in your hands, and you could mark what you might be interested in. And today, they say, oh, everything's so available and so flexible online. But in point of fact, the students are not going to browse, okay, through the whole of a catalog. They're already targeting. Okay, so I find a tremendous narrowness of knowledge. Okay, and a kind of naivete everywhere, and not just among students, but also among faculty, about the real nature of about human history. Okay, there's been just a series of great oppressive empires everywhere in the East and in the West. Okay, that had a certain cyclic kind of a pattern that can be seen, okay, as parallel to our own experience today, right? And I think that there's great knowledge and wisdom that comes from a vast perspective of history, starting with the earliest periods, okay, the Stone Age and the nomadic period, moving into the agrarian period, moving so on. So I think that that the curriculum has to be simplified, but the professors will never agree to it, because that's not how they've been trained, and our present professors would be incompetent, in fact, to think in a large point of view. But that's what students love. Students love a course that can give them, okay, the long view in great simple terms with the great trajectory of history.
And that in part has, I think, to do with the research orientation, which can be driving the curriculum. But I want to move on to the free speech issue. This is all connected, of course, but the whole notion of free speech and whether it should be limited or not limited and how it should be limited. So my first thought is, you limit speech in any way, and you tend to get students who give predictable, sort of timid responses. How do you, as somebody who feels that certain limitations should be placed on what students can say, I wonder what you say to that. The other side, of course, is that if you don't have civil discourse, how can learning be carried on? If students can't respect each other in the classroom, can they learn?
Right. I'm not so sure I would say I advocate restricting students' speech.
Maybe
but I would say, it's hard without a concrete example, but maybe. But I think the point is to provide an environment where they can say whatever they want, and then we can deconstruct it. And when you're talking about colonialism, for example, and why maybe the Halloween costume with the sombrero and the mariachi, why that's offensive, can become an entree to a discussion of the colonial period in the US, of the West, and it can begin to tie back to these issues, and we can talk about what are the particular legal needs of Latinos today, right? There's just a big Supreme Court case about voting rights for Latinos. So you can tie an incident from today to a long history using these current events. And so I don't think we want to not talk about them, but we want to find ways to talk about them where we don't start saying, you're limiting my speech. No, you're limiting my speech. No, okay, let's have a free speech zone where we're not yelling, but we're asking the questions. Why is this offensive?
Is it possible, though, that they could come away with feeling that some of these things are not offensive? People who think that they're offensive might say, well, you know what? It's not offensive.
Sure.
That doesn't ever seem to be the end point, though. It's always that they're being taught that it is offensive, as opposed to maybe, well, maybe wearing that sombrero made sense. It was sort of fun and cute, and they weren't meaning to be offensive, and I'm just throwing that out. I want to move to Title IX. Title IX is one of the areas where there's been a tremendous accumulation of discord. It was originally developed to allow women to have equal access to sports on the college campus, equal support for their sports as for men's sports. But it's been expanded now to include issues relating to sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, particularly with regard to women. although other groups as well. And I wonder what your thoughts are, and particularly you, Laura Beth, as a lawyer, thinking about Title IX, which was a university inculcated statute, would you call it, being used for the various reasons that it's being used now. Do you agree, and do you think it's been overstretched?
Well, I think the law was passed to ensure equal educational opportunity for women. And the first interpretations of the statute were around equity in payment for sports. And you can understand, as if you're a gender rights attorney, why that's very concrete. You spend $1 bajillion on the football team and you spend 5 cents on women's lacrosse or whatever. So it's concrete. You're able to say this is not the same kind of investment in men's sports and women's sports. And so that's where the litigation begins. But the overall statute is to provide equal educational opportunity for women. And so any of the things that are systematically preventing that, the university has an obligation under Title IX to take steps to try to remedy. They don't have an obligation to stop it. They can't stop it. But they do have to respond appropriately. And that means disciplining sexual predators. It means, firing professors who take sexual advantage of their student, perhaps. And so it's complicated, and we have to work through it. But I don't think it's being stretched too far. We still don't have women graduating at the same rates from graduate school. We have women entering college at the same rates as men. It's very raced, right? But we're not there yet in terms of equality. And I think it is appropriate for the state to play a role in remedying that kind of systemic inequality based on unearned privilege.
Well, we're going to stop here, and we're going to pick up this conversation in another episode, which will start momentarily. But right now, I'm going to say goodbye. Camille Paglia, Laura Beth Nielsen.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here today with us at the Drexel InterView.